Welcome. Dear listener, I'm glad you're here. Wherever you are in the world, let your shoulders drop just a little, as if you've been carrying a heavy bag all day and you finally set it down. Let your jaw relax. Let your hands loosen. You don't need to chase anything right now. You don't need to fix anything. You are allowed to rest. Take one slow breath in and let it out gently. Another breath in and out. If your mind is busy, that's okay. We won't fight it. We'll simply give it something calm to follow, the way you might watch rain slide down a window. Tonight's story is history, but it's also a soft place to land. Listen to Sleep isn't just about getting drowsy. It's a small art, moving from worry to quiet, from tension to ease, from thinking too much to thinking gently, and then not thinking at all. So let's open a door into the past. Not the dramatic Middle Ages of loud battles and bright banners, not the version with shouting and spectacle. We're going to walk into ordinary medieval life, the kind that repeats day after day, the kind that has the same small routines and the same familiar sounds: a pot over a fire, a wooden bowl, a loaf of bread, a slow turning of seasons. Our theme tonight is simple: why food could be so disappointing in medieval times for most people. But don't worry, this won't be told in a way that jolts you awake. We'll keep the tone gentle, we'll notice the details, but we won't linger on anything harsh. We're here for calm, and for perspective, and for the steady rhythm of a world that moved more slowly than ours. Picture a small home in a medieval village. The roof is thatched, the walls are timber or packed earth. The floor might be dirt, covered with rushes. The room is dim, but the fire gives a warm orange glow. Smoke curls upward, finding its way out through a hole in the roof or a narrow opening. Outside, the air is cold, or damp, or still. Inside, you hear a quiet bubbling from a pot. Now imagine the table. It's not polished, it's not perfectly level. It's a simple surface that has held many meals. On it sits a bowl of pottage, something like porridge, or a thin stew. It might be made from barley or rye. It might contain a few vegetables if the household is lucky, a little onion, a few greens, perhaps a handful of peas. Often it is pale, mild, and repetitive. Beside the bowl is bread, dense, dark, coarse. It's not the soft, fragrant loaf from a modern bakery. It's heavier, more stubborn. It fills the belly, but it doesn't necessarily bring joy. And if today's a good day, if the harvest was kind, there might be a few small scraps of meat, tough and stringy, saved for a special moment, or a small piece of cheese. But for most people, most of the time, the meal is grain and more grain, with little variation. This is the first quiet truth. For the majority of medieval people, food was not a pleasure. It was not a hobby. It was not a form of entertainment. Food was survival, and survival was often uncertain somewhere else. Far from this village home, there is another table, a long table in a hall lit by candles. Tapestries on the walls, servants moving softly, platters of roasted meats, sweet wine, decorative pastries shaped like birds and castles, and in the air, something the peasant household almost never smells: spices. If you want a gentle hook to hold onto tonight, it's this contrast. Two worlds living in the same century. One world eats to endure the day. The other world eats to display power. Spices, in particular, were a kind of edible distance. Today, you can buy cinnamon and pepper without thinking. But in the Middle Ages, pepper might travel farther than most villagers ever would in their entire lives. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, these were carried by merchants who faced storms, bandits, taxis, and long routes where anything could go wrong. And because spices traveled so far, they became expensive. Not just expensive in money, but expensive in risk. A pinch of pepper on a noble's dish was a signal: we can afford the world. A warm scent of cinnamon in wine was not simply flavor, it was status for the common people. Those flavors were mostly absent. Their seasonings were local: garlic, onions, mustard. Herbs, maybe vinegar. Those can be delicious, of course, but when your base meal is the same grain stew day after day, year after year, the taste becomes monotony. And monotony, more than anything, is what made medieval food feel disappointing. If your mind is still awake, let it rest on the word monotony. It's a slow word. It fits the pace of a pot simmering. It fits the pace of an old life that repeated itself. Now, you might wonder, why not eat more fruit and vegetables? Why not brighten the meal with fresh produce? The answer is not dramatic. It's seasonal. It's practical. Fresh produce arrives like a visitor and leaves quickly. In spring and summer, you might find greens, berries, apples, small fruits, perhaps from a garden or from hedgerows. But when autumn passes, winter comes, and the world becomes narrow. Without refrigeration, fresh food doesn't last. So medieval households had to preserve what they could. They dried fruit. They smoked and salted meat. They pickled vegetables. They fermented cabbage. These are clever methods, and they helped people survive. But preserved food has its own rhythm of taste: salty, sour, smoky, dry. It can be satisfying, but it also becomes repetitive when it's all you have. And some preservation methods required supplies salt, vinegar that poor families could not always spare. So the medieval diet leaned heavily on what could be stored: grains, barley, rye, oats, sometimes wheat. If you had access to it, grains could be carried, traded, stored. They could be turned into bread, porridge, gruel, thick soups. They filled the belly and fueled long labor. In a world where most work was physical, fullness mattered, but a grain-heavy diet can be unbalanced. It can lack variety, and it can lack nutrients. That doesn't mean medieval people were weak by nature. It means their bodies were asked to do a great deal with limited fuel. And when bodies are underfed, life becomes heavier. You tire sooner. You heal more slowly. You are more vulnerable to illness. We'll speak of illness gently, without detail, because we're here to sleep. Still, it helps to know that medieval life did not have modern food safety. People did not understand germs. Animals often lived close to people for warmth and protection. Water sources were not always clean. Cities could be crowded and unsanitary. All of this made food riskier, even when there was enough of it. Even nobles were not entirely protected. A lavish feast could still include spoiled meat. Heavy sauces and spices could hide unpleasant flavors. Richness could bring its own discomfort. In a strange way, medieval dining was precarious for everyone. Though the rich had far more choices and far more comfort in general. But before your mind drifts into anything too sharp, let's return to the steady rhythm of the peasant home. The fire, the pot, the bowl, the bread. The medieval day begins early. The fire is revived. Something is cooked. The meal is eaten. Work continues. Another meal arrives, often not very different from the first, and the seasons turn slowly. In the background, spring, summer, autumn, winter, like a wheel that never stops. Spring might bring tender greens, gathered carefully. Summer might bring a rare sweetness of fruit. Autumn brings the harvest, busy hands, aching backs, and the careful storing of food for cold months. Winter is the time when the pottage grows thinner, and bread becomes harder, and people learn to stretch what they have. In those quiet winters, stories mattered. People told tales of magical pots that never ran empty, of lands where tables were always set, not because they were foolish, but because hunger shapes imagination. When something is rare, you dream of it. When something is absent, you invent it. And this is a gentle thread we can carry into sleep. Human beings have always wanted comfort. They have always wanted enough. They have always found ways through routine, through community, through small acts of ingenuity to keep going. As we finish this first part, bring your attention back to your own breath, in and out. Your room is not a medieval cottage. You have modern safety. You don't need to worry about the next harvest. Let that fact be a soft gratitude, not a loud thought. In part 2, we'll move closer to the heart of medieval everyday eating, the pot of pottage, the world of bread, the rhythm of ale and water, and the small strategies households used to survive scarcity without losing all warmth and dignity. For now, let the lantern dim, let the past become a distant glow, and let your thoughts slow down, as if they are settling into a comfortable chair. Welcome back, dear listener. If you're still awake, that's perfectly all right. And if you're already drifting, that's wonderful too. Either way, you don't have to do anything. Just let these words move slowly past you, like quiet footsteps in a hallway, soft enough that you can fall asleep without noticing when it happens. Take a gentle breath in and let it go. Another breath in and out. Now, imagine dusk settling over a medieval village. The day has been long, the kind of day that begins with grey morning light and ends with tired hands. Smoke rises from thatched roofs in thin, patient streams. The air smells of damp wood, earth, and the faint sharpness of fermentation grain turning into ale, cabbage turning into sourness, time turning summer into winter. Inside a small home, the fire is the heart of everything. It doesn't roar like a bonfire. It breathes, it flickers, it warms the room just enough to make the cold outside feel far away. Over the flames, a pot hangs or rests on stones, and the pot is not just a cooking tool, it's a steady promise. Something warm will happen here, something familiar, something that keeps a body moving through another day. This is where we meet the most common medieval meal, pottage. Pottage is an old, practical word for a food that can be many things at once. It can be porridge, it can be soup, it can be stew. It depends on what the household has, what the season allows, and how much is being stretched. The recipe is rarely written down because it is not a recipe in the modern sense. It is a method, a rhythm, a way of turning what's available into something that feels like dinner. For most families, pottage begins with grain. Barley is common. Oats are common. Rye appears often, especially where wheat is harder to afford. Grains are dependable. They store well. They travel well. They fill the belly. In a world where so much is uncertain, grain is one of the few things that can be counted on, at least in good years. Into that grain base, a cook might add vegetables, onions, leeks, cabbage, peas, beans. The vegetables are not there to make the meal exciting. They are there to make it last. They offer a little change in texture, a little color, a little hint of something green. And sometimes, if the household is fortunate, there is a scrap of fat, a spoon of rendered grease, or a small bone left from a rare piece of meat. Not enough to call it a meat dish, but enough to make the pottage feel less empty. If you've ever cooked on a day when you didn't want to think, when you wanted comfort more than creativity, you already understand pottage. It is food that doesn't demand attention. It invites you to slow down. It asks you to chew without hurry. It is warm, soft, and steady. But the reason medieval food could feel so disappointing is that this steadiness could become sameness. Bread comes next, because bread was the other anchor of everyday life. Modern bread can be light and airy, full of fragrance and variety. Medieval bread, especially for poorer people, was often dense and dark. It might be rye bread, barley bread, oat bread, or bread made from mixed grains. Flour was not always fine. Milling could leave tiny bits of grit, and over time those little grains of stone could wear teeth down. It's a small detail, but it tells you how rough the edges of life could be. Even the bread carried the texture of labor. Bread was not simply bought whenever you wanted. Baking required fuel, and fuel meant effort. Not every home had an oven. In some places, people used communal ovens. They might carry their dough to a shared baking place, waiting their turn, hoping the weather stayed kind, hoping the oven heat was right. Bread could be an event, one that depended on schedules, neighbors, and resources. And then there was storage. In damp cottages, bread could mold quickly. In dry conditions, it could harden fast, yet people did not waste it. Stale bread might be softened in broth, crumbled into pottage, or chewed slowly with a sip of weak ale. When food is scarce, even a hard crust has value. Even a tough bite has meaning. Let's linger with bread a little longer, because bread shaped the hours of a day. In many villages, baking day had its own quiet anticipation. A household would mix dough in a wooden trough, using water that had been carried in buckets, and flour that might have been saved carefully for weeks. Fingers would press and fold, the motion steady and almost meditative. If yeast was available, the dough might rise a little, slowly. If not, the bread would be flatter and heavier. A simple disc baked near the heat. Sometimes the dough would travel. A child might carry it in a covered bowl, careful not to trip, walking toward the village oven. The communal oven was a warm, busy place, yet still ordinary, still calm in its own way. People waited their turn. They talked softly. They compared harvests and weather. They watched the heat, because the heat mattered. Too much burns the crust. and too little leaves the loaf damp. In that waiting, bread became more than food. It became a shared routine, a small thread tying neighbors together. And because bread was so important, it also became a temptation for cheating, for stretching, for survival. In years when grain was scarce, some bakers added whatever they could grind and hide inside the dough, not always from cruelty. Sometimes from fear. The family might be one bad week away from ruin. A sack of flour might not last. A loaf might have to become two. Even so, medieval communities did try to protect the basics. There were rules and punishments, public shaming, fines. Yet the problem with rules is that rules cannot create grain. Rules cannot fill a barn. When scarcity presses down, people bend, even when they don't want to. This is why bread became a marker of class. The whiter, softer loaves made from finer wheat flour were more available to the wealthy. The darker, heavier loaves belonged to the working majority. In some regions, the difference was so visible that you could guess a person's status by the bread on their table. Now, if you're listening for sleep, you might notice that these details have a gentle effect. They slow time. They pull the mind away from modern noise. They return attention to simple objects. A bowl, a loaf, a cup. It's a quieter world. And your body often relaxes when your imagination enters a quieter world. But let's keep walking. You might wonder about meat, because meat feels like the missing piece. Why wasn't it eaten more often? Animals were precious. A cow was milk and labor. A horse was labor. A pig was future food. Yes, but also a stored asset, something that could be traded or sold. Chickens produced eggs. Goats produced milk. Slaughtering an animal was not a casual decision. It was a choice that changed your future. So for many households, meat appeared only on special occasions, religious feasts, weddings, major holidays, or when an animal was too old to be useful in other ways. When meat did appear, it was often preserved, salted, smoked, dried. Preservation was necessary, but it changed the texture. Salted pork could be tough. Smoked meat could be chewy. Dried meat could feel almost leathery. And even preserved meat could spoil if storage failed or if the weather turned against you. Fish sometimes provided a more common source of protein, especially for those living near rivers, lakes, or the sea. Yet fish, too, was often preserved, dried, salted, smoked so that it could last through lean days. Fresh fish, for many inland families, was a rarity. What they knew better was the taste of salt and smoke, the taste of winter stored in barrels. And then, of course, there was drink. In many medieval places, clean water was not reliably available. Wells could be contaminated. Streams might carry waste. People did not understand bacteria, but they noticed patterns. Sometimes water brought sickness. Because of this, fermented drinks became everyday companions. Ale, small beer, light wine, often weaker than modern versions, were consumed by adults and children alike. They provided calories and, in some cases, felt safer than plain water. Brewing itself was another form of transforming grain into something that could be stored for a time. A household might brew at home, or an alewife might brew to sell. The result varied. Some batches were hearty and pleasant. Some turned sour. and some were stretched, watered down to make them go further. A thin, weak ale might not taste wonderful, but it was still a familiar comfort, a warm liquid that settled the stomach after long work. You can imagine an alewife at the edge of a village, stirring a steaming vat as evening comes in. She listens to the bubbling the way a modern person listens to a kettle. She's thinking about grain, about pennies, about mouths to feed. She may water the brew a little, not because she is proud of it, but because she is trying to keep her household afloat. Survival blurs the clean lines of right and wrong. It makes small compromises feel like doors that must be opened, even when you wish you could keep them closed. If you want a calm image, imagine a wooden cup warming a tired hand. The drink inside is not glamorous. It is not meant to impress. It is meant to soothe. It is meant to be enough. I have the stool. Now, there is one more gentle truth we should mention: the environment of eating. Many rural households lived close to their animals. Livestock might be brought indoors during cold nights for warmth and protection. The floor might be dirt. Smoke might linger. Insects were part of life. This did not mean people were careless. Many people worked hard to keep order, but without running water, without modern sanitation. The limits were real. In towns and cities, the challenges grew: crowded streets, poor drainage, and piles of waste could make cleanliness difficult. Markets were busy and exposed. Food could spoil. Flies could gather. Rodents could appear. It made every meal feel a little uncertain, even when the pot was full. And yet this is the part I want you to keep, the part that softens everything. People still created warmth. They created it through routine, through the shared pot, through the careful breaking of bread, so everyone received a portion, through the quiet conversations at the end of the day, through the simple relief of sitting down, even briefly, and letting the body rest while the fire crackled. History is not only kings and battles. Much of it is evenings like this, tired families, warm food, familiar flavors, the same meal as yesterday, and the gentle hope that tomorrow will be manageable. So as you listen, allow your mind to settle into that hope. Not a big hope, not a dramatic hope, just the soft kind, the hope of warmth, the hope of enough, the hope of sleep. In the next part, we'll step deeper into the seasons and the arts of preservation, how medieval households tried to store summer for winter, how pickling and drying shaped taste, and why a single bad harvest could change everything. We'll keep the pace slow. We'll keep it calm. We'll let the details drift like feathers. For now, let your breathing stay easy, in and out. The bowl on the table cools. The fire lowers itself to embers, and the village night grows quiet, quiet enough for sleep. If thoughts return, let them return gently. Imagine the pots slow bubbling as a metronome, and the steady work of hands that once fed a family with almost nothing. You don't need to solve their world or yours tonight. Just rest and let the story hold the night for you. Welcome again. Dear listener, if you're comfortable, let your eyes soften. If they're already closed, even better, take a slow breath in and let it out as if you're releasing the whole day through a small opening in your chest. Nothing is required of you now. You can simply float along with the story, letting it carry you the way a calm river carries a leaf. Tonight we continue our gentle walk through medieval food, and we do it by following the turning of the seasons. because in the Middle Ages, the menu was not chosen from a shelf or ordered from a screen. It was chosen by weather, daylight, soil, and time. The year itself decided what you could eat and when. So imagine a medieval village again, not as a scene of drama, but as a slow landscape, fields beyond the houses, a path worn into the earth, a church bell somewhere in the distance, a small garden behind a cottage, if the family is fortunate, and around everything, the long, patient wheel of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. If you want a soothing thought to hold in your mind, it is this. Medieval people lived close to the calendar of nature. Their lives rose and fell with it. And that closeness created both anxiety and comfort. Anxiety, because a bad season could mean hunger. Comfort, because the pattern was familiar, dependable in its own way. Spring returned. Summer arrived. Autumn came. Winter followed. And then, somehow, spring returned again. Let's begin in spring, because spring is a quiet kind of relief. After a long winter of stored foods, salt, smoke, dry grain, spring offered the first fresh tastes, not in abundance, but in small gifts, tender greens, early herbs, sometimes nettles, sometimes wild garlic, sometimes young leaves gathered from hedgerows by people who knew the land the way you know the rooms of your home. These greens might end up in the pot, stirred into pottage to give it color and a hint of brightness. They might be boiled, softened, and eaten with bread. They weren't the vibrant salads of modern life, but they were fresh, and freshness itself was a kind of luxury. Spring also meant work. Of course, fields had to be prepared, seed had to be sown, tools had to be repaired. The body ached from the winter, and then it ached again from the new labor. Yet the smell of damp soil and the sight of new shoots carried a quiet promise. If the weather holds, if the rains are gentle, if the pests stay away, there will be food later. Now let's drift into summer. Summer was the season of growth, and for some households it was the closest thing to variety. Gardens, when they existed, produced onions, leeks, cabbages, and beans. Fruits appeared, small apples, berries, perhaps pears in certain places, though much of it belonged to whoever owned the trees or the land. Even so, summer brought more color to the pot, more greens, more chances for something that didn't taste like winter. But summer had its own worry. You could feel the clock ticking. What ripened now might not last long, and if you did not preserve what you could, the cold months would arrive with an empty shelf. So summer was also the beginning of quiet preparation. People dried herbs in bundles, hanging them in rafters where smoke and air could keep them from spoiling. They gathered fruit when they could and laid slices out to dry, turning sweetness into something that could last. They watched the weather closely, because a wet spell could spoil a drying batch, and a storm could knock fruit down before it was ready. In some homes, you might find a simple wooden rack near the hearth, where thin slices of apple rested like little moons, shrinking day by day as warmth pulled moisture away. Nearby, strings of onions might hang, papery skins rustling softly whenever the door opened. None of it looked luxurious, but it looked like intention. It looked like care. And there was always the garden, when there was one small, practical, close to the house. A place to pull a leak when the pot needed something. A place to gather a handful of peas, knowing each pea mattered. A place to cut cabbage that would become winter food. Then, almost without warning, summer turned toward autumn. Autumn was the great turning point. The harvest season. The busy season. The season that made people's muscles sore. Their backs stiff. Their hands rough. The air grew crisp. The light tilted. And, for a few weeks, there could be a sense of abundance. Even in poor households, grain coming in, vegetables being pulled up, apples being collected, and the precious work of storing beginning in earnest. If you listen closely, you can hear the harvest as a kind of steady music, the scrape of sickles in grain, the soft thud of bundles set down, the murmur of voices counting and calling, and the occasional laugh that breaks through fatigue, even when life was hard. There were moments when the village felt like one body moving together, sharing the labor the way people share heat around a fire. Sometimes there was a small celebration after the harvest, nothing excessive for most, but a brief moment of fuller bowls, a thicker pottage, bread that didn't have to be stretched quite so far. Perhaps, if a household had saved for it, a bit of pork or a chicken, for a night or two, people could eat without the same tight knot of worry. And then, gently, they went back to planning for winter. This is where preservation becomes the main character of our story. In the Middle Ages, preservation wasn't a hobby or a culinary trend. It was survival. It was the careful art of keeping food from becoming nothing. One of the most important tools was salt. Salt could turn fresh meat into winter food. It could draw moisture out, slow spoilage, and create something that could be eaten weeks or months later. But salt was not free. It was traded, taxed, transported. For many households, it was precious, used carefully, pinched out like a guarded treasure. Imagine a woman, let's call her Matilda, a name that could belong to many centuries, standing at a table in late autumn. Her hands are steady from years of work. In front of her is a wooden tub, and beside it a small sack of salt she treats with the seriousness of coin. She rubs salt into pork, layer after layer, pressing it into every edge, not because she enjoys the work, but because she understands the future. Winter's not a surprise to her. Winter is an appointment that always arrives. When a family slaughtered a pig, often a major event, nothing went to waste. Fat might be rendered into lard. Meat might be salted. Some parts might be smoked if there was a place and fuel for it. Sausages might be made. Bones might be saved for broth. This was not wasteful cooking. It was careful, respectful, and practical. It was the kind of cooking that comes from knowing how close hunger can stand. Smoking and drying were other methods, especially in colder regions or places with good airflow. A fish might be smoked to last longer. Meat might be hung where smoke could reach it. Even then, the result was often tough, salty, and intense. More a necessity than a pleasure. But necessity can still be comforting. A strip of smoked meat, even hard-edged, could make winter feel less empty. Fermentation was another quiet miracle. Cabbage could be shredded and packed down to ferment into something sour and stable. That sourness wasn't meant to be fancy. It was meant to preserve vitamins and add a little variety. Pickling with vinegar was also used when possible. Onions, cucumbers, and other vegetables might be placed in brine or vinegar to keep them through winter. Again, Vinegar could be costly, so this was easier for some households than others. If you've ever opened a jar of something fermented, something sharp and alive, you know the feeling. Time has changed the food. Medieval people lived with that change constantly. They learned to accept sourness as a friend, because sourness meant survival. It meant the cabbage didn't vanish into rot. It meant the vegetable stayed present, waiting, like a stored memory. Drying fruit was common where fruit was available. Apples and pears could be sliced and hung, turning into chewy winter snacks, not sweet like modern dried fruit, but still a change from grain and salt. A child might be given one dried slice as a treat, and that small sweetness could feel like sunlight preserved in a pocket. And grain, of course, was stored as carefully as possible. Sacks of barley, rye, oats, sometimes wheat might be kept in a dry place, protected from damp and from mice. The storeroom, if a family had one, was a quiet space of anxiety and hope. Each sack was a promise, but also a question: will it last? Will the roof leak? Will pests get in? Will the winter be long? Will someone in the household fall sick and eat more slowly? Or less? Or not at all? To protect grain, people used whatever they could: raised platforms, sealed containers, cats when cats were around, and careful vigilance. Yet mice were clever, and damp could creep in like a silent fog. Medieval life required attention to small threats: a cracked lid, a wet corner, a hole in a sack, tiny things that could become big problems over months. If you are drifting towards sleep, you may find something oddly calming about this image: a storeroom in autumn, filled with the year's work, and a family moving quietly through it, counting, planning, trying to make the future safe. Now, let's speak gently about another place where food could be steadier: monasteries. Monastic communities often kept gardens and orchards behind stone walls. They had routines, rules, and labor organized with a different kind of stability. Their storerooms could be fuller, their gardens better tended, their preservation methods more consistent. Sometimes, though not always, this meant there might be bread given to the poor at the gate, or a bowl of soup offered to a traveler. Even a small act of charity could feel enormous to someone living close to hunger. But for most people, the monastery was a distant presence, sometimes a place of help, sometimes simply a reminder that some lives were more sheltered than others. Even so, the idea of a well-kept garden behind stone walls is a calming one: order, routine, and a quiet kind of plenty, at least compared to the open uncertainty of the fields. Now, we return to the most difficult season: winter. Winter narrowed everything. Fresh greens faded. Fruit disappeared. The pot became simpler. The bread became harder. The preserved foods took over: salted meat, dried fish, fermented cabbage, dried peas and beans. The flavors of winter were strong in a specific way: salt, smoke, sourness, and they repeated. They were practical, not playful. Winter was also the season when the pottage could grow thinner. As weeks passed, families might stretch grain farther by adding more water. They might use more cabbage and fewer peas. They might crumble more stale bread into broth. They might scrape the bottom of a barrel and pretend it was enough. And as the months continued, the fear of the hungry gap grew. The hungry gap was the stretch of time, often late winter into early spring, when stored food ran low and new crops were not yet ready. It was the time when bellies were emptiest, when patience was tested, when the body felt tired in a deeper way. And here, softly, we touch the shadow that sat behind medieval meals. The possibility of a failed harvest. A modern person can imagine shortage, but medieval shortage could be absolute. If drought came, if floods came, if frost came at the wrong moment, if blight or pests struck, the harvest could collapse. And because there were no large safety nets, no refrigerated transport, no global supply chain, the consequences could be immediate and frightening. But we will not dwell on fear tonight. We will only acknowledge it in the way you might acknowledge a distant thunderstorm while remaining safe indoors. Instead, let's notice something else. How people responded. They rationed, they shared, they adjusted, they foraged when they could. They found edible plants, roots, and greens that modern people might not recognize. They leaned on community neighbors, relatives, sometimes the church, sometimes a local lord if charity was offered, and they kept the pot going. Because the pot was more than food. It was routine. It was warmth. It was the sense that, despite everything, the household remained a household. If you have ever had a difficult time in your life, you might understand this instinct. When life becomes uncertain, small routines become precious. Making tea, folding a blanket, turning on a lamp. In medieval life, stirring the pot and baking bread were those routines. They were the soft edges that kept days from tearing apart. Now, as we prepare to move on, I want to give you a very gentle image, one that helps the mind relax. Picture a medieval kitchen in late autumn. The air is cool, the fire is low, herbs hang in bundles from a beam, apples are laid out to dry near the warmth. A crock of fermenting cabbage sits in the corner, its lid heavy, its contents quietly transforming. The household is tired from harvest work, but there is a calm satisfaction too, the feeling of preparing for winter, of doing what must be done. Outside, leaves fall. Inside, the pot simmers, the same slow sound, again and again, like a lullaby made of water and heat. In part 4, we'll step into another side of medieval food that shaped daily life, the world of markets, the temptation to stretch and adulterate staples like bread and ale, and the quiet reasons why quality could be uncertain even when food existed. We'll keep it gentle. We'll keep it steady. We'll let it feel more like a story than a lecture. For now, let your breath be easy, in and out. If your thoughts drift, let them drift into the autumn storeroom, where the year is packed into sacks and jars, where winter is waiting outside, but warmth is waiting inside. And if sleep is already reaching for you, you don't have to resist it. You can let the lantern go dim and let the season turn quietly in your dreams. Welcome back, dear listener. If your day has left little knots of tension in your shoulders or behind your eyes, let them loosen a little. Take a slow breath in and let it out softly, as if you're cooling a spoonful of soup. There is no rush here. Tonight we keep moving at a calm pace, following the ordinary paths of medieval life, paths worn smooth by repetition. In the last part, we stood in the storeroom with the seasons, watching people dry fruit, salt meat, and pack cabbage into crocks so winter would feel a little less sharp. Tonight, we step out of the home and into the places where food changed hands. Village ovens, market stalls, small taverns, and narrow streets where a person could buy their daily bread, or hope they did. And as we walk, we meet a gentle but important truth about medieval food. Even when food existed, it was not always what it claimed to be. Not because medieval people were uniquely dishonest, but because the Middle Ages could be tight and uncertain. Grain prices rose and fell with weather and war. A bad harvest turned ordinary life into a careful calculation. And when survival depends on a sack of flour, people begin to make small bargains with reality. They stretch, they dilute, they compromise. Sometimes they do it out of greed, and sometimes out of fear. Often it is hard to separate the two. So let's begin with bread again, because bread was the center of everything. Imagine a baker in a medieval town. His shop is small, warm from the oven, and scented with yeast and smoke. The street outside is busy with footfalls and voices. People come with coins or with small trades, and they want what they always want, a loaf that will carry them through the day. The baker knows their faces. He knows who has children, who has an elderly parent, who has a husband away at war. He knows who can pay and who will ask for credit. He knows that if he loses his reputation, the town will turn away from him. And yet he also knows something else. The flour is running low. Maybe the harvest was thin. Maybe a merchant raised the price. Maybe a local lord demanded more grain as rent. Whatever the reason, the baker stands before his kneading trough and feels the quiet pressure of arithmetic. How many loaves can he make with what remains? How many mouths depend on him? In a perfect world, the answer would be simple. Make fewer loaves. Sell them honestly. Accept the loss. But medieval life was not a perfect world, and a baker who could not sell enough might not pay his fees, might not feed his own family, might not keep his place in town. So sometimes quietly, quickly, with the door closed, a baker might stretch the dough, not with anything dramatic, not with something meant to poison, but with things that were cheap and available, ground acorns in hard years, bran and coarse meal, even chalky powders or fine sawdust in the most desperate stories. The goal was not to make bread delicious. The goal was to make bread exist. The result could be a loaf that looked like bread but felt wrong in the mouth, gritty, heavy, more tiring to chew than it should be. Yet to the hungry, even that loaf might be better than nothing. In a world where the belly's ache could be louder than pride, people often swallowed disappointment along with their supper. If this sounds bleak, let it soften in your mind. We are not here to judge. We are here to understand the quiet corner where necessity and honesty meet, and where necessity often wins. Now let's drift from bread to drink, because drink was the other daily companion. In many medieval places, clean water was uncertain. People did not know about microbes, but they knew that some wells made people ill, that some rivers tasted of waste, that sickness traveled through a village like a cold wind. So fermented drinks, ale, small beer, light wine became part of daily life. They weren't always meant to be strong. Often they were mild, safer feeling, and filled with calories. Imagine a tavern at the edge of town. It is not a place of wild celebration tonight, just a warm room where tired workers step in for a brief rest. The air holds the scent of damp wool and wood smoke. A few candles tremble. In the corner, A barrel sits like a patient animal, waiting to be tapped. The person serving the drink, an alewife, perhaps has spent hours brewing. She has watched grain boil, cooled it, fermented it, waited. She knows how much work went into this liquid comfort. She also knows how quickly it disappears. If grain is expensive, if taxes are heavy, if her children's shoes are thin, the temptation appears. Add water, stretch the barrel, serve more cups. The customers might grumble that it tastes weak, but they will still drink. Because what else is there? Better a mild, sour ale than a risky sip from a questionable stream. Better a watered cup than none at all. So the alewife pours, and her hands are steady, and her face is practiced. She tells herself she will make the next batch better. She tells herself the town will not notice. She tells herself that survival requires bending, not breaking. In the medieval imagination, the alewife was a familiar figure, sometimes respected, sometimes blamed. If her brew was good, she was praised. If it was thin or sour, the town's frustration could turn sharp. People wanted their small comforts to be dependable. When life is hard, a disappointing cup feels like a personal insult. Yet we can also see her life with gentle eyes, a woman balancing household need against community expectation, stirring a cauldron as the world presses in from every side. In some towns, authorities tried to keep these compromises under control. Because bread and ale were staples, they were also political. If bread became too small or too expensive, people grew angry. If ale was watered down too often, trust eroded. So medieval governments created rules, standards for weights, measures, and prices. Punishments meant to discourage cheating. Officials who checked loaves and tasted brew. In England, one of the most famous sets of regulations was the Assize of Bread and Ale, a framework that tried to tie the price and quality of these staples to the cost of grain. We don't need to hold the law's details tonight. We only need to feel its purpose, to make daily survival a little less uncertain, and to prevent the worst abuses when scarcity made people vulnerable. Enforcement, however, was uneven. A law can be written in ink, but hunger is written in the body. When flour is scarce, the baker's hands still hover over his trough. When grain is expensive, the alewife still looks at her barrel and thinks of her children. And officials themselves were part of the same world, sometimes diligent, sometimes bribed, sometimes simply overwhelmed. So adulteration continued in many forms, sometimes blatant, sometimes subtle. A loaf might be a little lighter than it should be. A cup might be a little thinner than promised. A merchant might mix old grain with new. A cellar might disguise spoilage with salt, smoke, or strong herbs. These were not always crimes of cruelty. Often they were crimes of pressure, small dishonesties grown from tight margins and tighter winters. Now, to keep our tone calm, let's step away from the idea of fraud and look instead at how ordinary people navigated this uncertainty. A medieval buyer learned to be cautious. They felt a loaf's weight in the hand. They watched the baker's face. They noticed who bought first and who complained. They tasted ale with a practiced tongue, not expecting perfection, only hoping for something honest enough. Families also developed strategies. They baked at home when they could, or used the communal oven, because making your own bread meant fewer surprises. They brewed small batches when possible. They stored what they could and traded carefully. And when a product seemed wrong, they adapted. Stale bread went into pottage. Weak ale was used anyway, because wasting was not an option. There is a strange comfort in this practicality. It is the comfort of people who do not expect life to be perfectly fair, and who still find a way to live inside it. If you're listening for sleep, let your mind rest in the small motions of this world. A baker presses dough, folds it, presses again. The rhythm is slow and physical. Flour dust floats in the warm air like pale smoke. The oven's heat is steady, and the loaf becomes what it will become. An alewife stirs a vat. The surface rippling gently. Steam rises. The smell is grain and yeast. Faintly sweet, faintly sour. The motion of her arm is repetitive, and repetition is soothing. A buyer stands at a stall, coins in hand, not rushing, choosing carefully. Behind them, the town murmurs a low, constant sound that blends into the evening like wind through leaves. And beyond the town, in the fields, the same truth waits. Everything depends on harvest. The best laws in the world cannot create grain out of thin air. The best baker in the world cannot bake without flour. The best brewer cannot brew without malt. So medieval life remained vulnerable to weather, and vulnerability invited compromise. As we close this part, I want to offer a gentle reflection that can settle easily in the mind. In our modern world, we often treat food as identity, as pleasure, as choice. That can be a beautiful thing, but it can also bring its own kind of noise. Too many decisions, too many options, too much pressure to optimize. Medieval people, especially the poor, lived with far fewer options. Their meals were repetitive, yes, and often disappointing. Yet the simplicity of their routine also carried a certain quiet clarity. Eat what exists, save what can be saved, share when possible, endure the season, and hope for the next harvest. One last gentle scene. Before we close, a market at first light. Stalls are set out under pale morning sky. A woman lays onions in a neat row, their skins catching the dawn. A man stacks small wheels of cheese, each one wrapped and careful. Someone pours grain from a sack into a measure, the kernels sounding like soft rain in a bucket. Buyers move slowly, feeling loaves, asking quiet questions, choosing with the kind of attention that comes from living close to limits. In that careful choosing, there is a calm lesson. When life is uncertain, people learn to be present with small things. A loaf in the hand, a cup on the tongue, a pot warming at home, and presence, gentle, steady presence is also what helps you drift into sleep. So let your mind rest there, on those small ordinary objects, until even they fade into a quiet, comfortable dark. Before we move on, we can linger for a moment on the way a medieval town felt at night, because setting matters for sleep as much as facts do. Imagine you are walking slowly along a narrow street after sunset. The stones are uneven beneath your feet. In the shallow light of a lantern, everything looks softer, as if the world has been wrapped in brown cloth. You pass the baker's shop. The oven's heat is fading now, but the doorway still breathes warmth. A few loaves rest on a board, cooling in the dim, their crusts dull rather than shining, their shapes slightly imperfect. like handmade things always are. The baker, let's call him Alric, wipes his hands on his apron. He counts coins with a tired thumb. Not greedily, just carefully. In his mind, he is counting tomorrow, how much flour remains, whether the miller will raise the price, whether the next cart of grain will arrive. A few doors down, a woman, Agnes, perhaps closes the lid on her brewing vessel. The ale inside will continue its quiet work while she sleeps. Fermentation is patient. It never hurries. It turns grain into comfort, drop by drop, bubble by bubble. Agnes listens to that faint bubbling with the same attention a modern person might give to distant rain. It is a small sound that means something is still working in your favor. And when a household wants to protect itself from disappointment, it does what medieval people often did. It adds one more layer of practicality. Leftover bread is dried into hard slices that keep longer. They are not tender, but they last. They can be softened later in broth. They can become tomorrow's meal when tomorrow's meal is uncertain. This is the gentle wisdom of the time. Nothing is wasted, because waste is risk. So let your breathing remain slow, in and out. In part 5, we will speak about cleanliness and contamination, but we will do it with care, focusing on atmosphere rather than unpleasant detail. For now, let the market street fade. Let Auric's oven cool completely. Let Agnes's brew settle into its steady bubbling. Let the town's murmurs become distant like waves far from shore. And if you feel yourself drifting, you can drift. You do not need to hold every sentence. You can allow the words to blur, to soften, to become background, until the only thing you notice is your own calm breathing and the quiet promise of sleep. Welcome back, dear listener. Before we step into tonight's chapter, take a slow breath in and let it go. If you feel any tightness in your chest or belly, imagine it loosening the way warm water loosens a knot in fabric. You are safe where you are. You are here in the present, in your own room, and this story is only a soft lantern held at a distance. Tonight, we talk about something that could make medieval food feel especially uncertain. Cleanliness. What people could control. What they couldn't. And the quiet ways they tried to live with risks they didn't fully understand. We'll keep this gentle, no graphic details, no harsh images, just a calm walk through an older world where knowledge was limited, but observation was sharp, and daily life required steady adaptation. Imagine a medieval home again. At the edge of a village, the room is small, the hearth is warm. Outside, the air is cold enough to make you pull your cloak tighter. Inside, a pot simmers, the bowl waits on the table. Everything looks simple, almost peaceful, until you remember that the medieval world did not have the invisible protections we rely on today. There were no refrigerators humming quietly in the background, no sealed packages, no clean running water from a tap, no clear understanding that tiny organisms too small to see could move from hand to food, from waste to well, from market stall to dinner bowl. People had their own theories. Many believed illness came from bad air, from foul smells, from mists that carried sickness, and sometimes, in a practical way, that belief led them to useful habits, avoiding places that stank, opening windows when weather allowed, preferring fresh breezes over damp corners. For many families, the simplest question of safety was also the most basic. Water is quiet. It seems innocent. It reflects the sky. But in medieval life, water could be uncertain, wells might be shallow, rain might wash dirt and waste into streams. Animals might drink from the same sources people used. In towns, especially, rivers could serve as both lifeline and dumping place. The same current that brought water could also carry away refuse. It's not a pleasant thought, so we will keep it distant, like remembering a storm from inside a warm house. Because water was uncertain, people often turned toward fermentation as a kind of shield. Ale, small beer, light wines, these weren't only for enjoyment, they were also, in many places, a practical alternative. Brewing involved boiling, and fermentation changed the liquid in ways that sometimes reduced the risk of sickness. The drinks were often weak by modern standards, mild, nourishing, and part of daily routine. So you can picture a medieval table with wooden cups, not because people were always celebrating, but because a cup of weak ale could feel safer than a cup of questionable water. It's a strange comfort, but it is still comfort. A familiar drink, a familiar taste, something that settles the stomach after hard work. Now let's move from water to the spaces where food lived. In rural homes, families often shared space with animals, especially in cold seasons. A pig might be brought inside at night. Chickens might wander near the doorway. A cow might be kept close for warmth and protection. This closeness wasn't only poverty, it was also practical security. Animals were wealth. They were food in the future. They were labor. Letting them out of sight could mean losing them to thieves or predators. But closeness had a cost. Dirt traveled. Insects traveled. Fleas and lice were common companions in medieval life, not as moral failure, but as reality. Smoke filled rooms and clung to hair and cloth. Floors were often earth or rough boards. Cleaning was labor-intensive without modern tools, and even the cleanest household could not create modern hygiene. Still, many medieval people cared about cleanliness. Housewives scrubbed bowls. They rinsed cloths. They swept rushes. They scoured pots with sand or ash. They boiled what they could. They dried what they could. They tried. It's important to remember that the medieval world was not indifferent. It was simply limited. Now consider the medieval market. Markets were lively places, voices bargaining, baskets thumping down, knives tapping boards, the smell of bread and onions and smoke. They were also exposed places. Meat sat out in open air. Fish waited on tables. Flies came and went with the season. And in crowded streets, where refuse might not be removed promptly, the line between clean and unclean was difficult to maintain. A shopper learned to be careful. They looked closely. They sniffed. They touched bread to judge firmness. They chose sellers they trusted. Trust mattered, because standards were inconsistent. Some stalls were honest and careful. Others were rushed. Others were desperate. If you want a calm image here, let it be the rhythm of a market rather than its risks. A woman choosing onions one by one. A baker lifting loaves onto a board. A child clutching a small coin tightly. A vendor pouring grain into a measure. The kernels sounding like soft rain in a bucket. Now, we should speak gently about the consequences of all this uncertainty. Illness. Digestive sickness was common in medieval life. Food could spoil. Water could carry contamination. Parasites existed. People did not have antibiotics. A sickness that feels minor today could become serious then. Even nobles, with their grand halls and fine dishes, were not immune. A lavish table did not guarantee safe ingredients. Wealth reduced some risks, but it did not remove them. There is an old story often told about King John of England, who fell ill and died in 1216 after a bout of sickness that chroniclers associated with overindulgence, sometimes mentioning fruit and new cider. Historians debate the exact cause, but the larger truth remains. Even the powerful could be felled by food or drink that turned against them. The medieval world could be precarious at every level. And then there were the cities. If villages had space and air, cities had density, narrow streets, crowded housing, animals, people, waste, and trade all pressed into the same corridors. In some places, refuse was thrown into streets or into rivers. Smells gathered. Water sources suffered. Rodents found opportunity. It was the kind of environment where disease could move quickly when it arrived. The most haunting example, of course, is the plague that swept through Europe in the 14th century, what we call the Black Death. We won't dwell on it. We won't paint it in dark colors. We only acknowledge that the conditions of medieval life, crowding, poor sanitation, pests helped disease spread. People did not know the true mechanism. Many blamed air, stars, sin, strangers. They searched for meaning as much as they searched for medicine. And yet, amid all this, people also created small pockets of order. Some monasteries kept stricter hygiene routines. Some hospitals tried to separate the sick. Some households boiled water when they could. Some towns attempted regulations about waste, about butchers, about markets, often unevenly, often imperfectly, but with intent. Even the simplest action, washing a bowl, boiling a pot, drying a cloth in sunlight, was a form of quiet resistance against the world's mess. If you are listening as you fall asleep, you might notice how these small actions feel soothing. They are repetitive. They are manageable. They are the kind of tasks that tell the mind there is something you can do. Even when you cannot control everything, you can control one corner. So imagine a medieval kitchen in the evening. A woman sets a pot aside after supper. The fire is low. She pours a small amount of water into a bowl and swirls it, rinsing away the day. She scrubs a wooden spoon with ash, then rinses it again. She hangs a cloth near the warmth to dry. She sweeps the floor, pushing debris toward the door. These are not glamorous moments, but they are human moments, and they carry a quiet calm. Outside, the air is cold. Inside, the hearth still holds heat. The family settles. The animals quiet down. The house grows still. Now, let's bring this back to the feeling of medieval food, sucking. As our blunt theme puts it, it wasn't only blandness. It wasn't only monotony. It was also uncertainty. You could do everything right, work hard, preserve carefully, buy from the market, and still become ill. You could eat a meal that looked fine and discover later that it wasn't. That kind of uncertainty adds a subtle stress to daily life. A stress modern people rarely feel when they open a sealed container or drink from a tap. And still, medieval people slept. They lay down at the end of days that were longer and heavier than ours. They listened to wind in thatch, to rain on roof, to the faint sounds of animals shifting in the dark. They closed their eyes and hoped morning would come gently. If you want to borrow something from them tonight, borrow their acceptance of rhythm. They could not control the whole world, so they held on to what they could: the pot, the bread, the fire, the familiar cup, the routines of cleaning and storing and sweeping. They found calm not in perfect safety, but in steady repetition. As we end this part, let the story soften around you. Picture a quiet street in a medieval town after dark. The market stalls are closed. The day's scraps have been gathered, or at least pushed aside. A lantern glows in a doorway. Somewhere, a kettle is set near embers, warming water for the morning. Somewhere, a baker's hands are already planning tomorrow's dough. Somewhere, an alewife listens to fermentation bubbling quietly beneath a lid. A small sound that means something is still working, still transforming, still becoming. Before we leave this topic, we can linger a little longer with the senses of that older world. Not to disturb you, but to slow time even more. Think of the sound of water being carried in a bucket. It sloshes gently with each step. A person might walk to a well or a stream, and the walk itself becomes part of the day's rhythm. The bucket is heavy, the mind becomes simple. When the water is poured into a pot, it makes a low, familiar splash. Even in a world of uncertainty, that splash is steady. It happens the same way every time. And think of sunlight. 2. Kitchens relied on sun and air as allies. A cloth dried in sunlight felt cleaner. A bowl left where a breeze touched it seemed fresher. People might not have spoken of sterilizing, but they knew dampness was an enemy. Dampness meant mold, rot, and sour smells, so they tried to keep things dry, hanging herbs in rafters, resting spoons near warmth, setting cups upside down so they could drain. Even hearth smoke, unpleasant as it could be, had a strange protective role. It dried rafters. It discouraged some insects. It flavored food in ways people came to accept as normal. The medieval home smelled of smoke the way modern homes smell faintly of soap, simply part of life. Now imagine a small household preparing fish or stew. The cook does not assume it is safe. They look closely, they wash what they can, and they cook it thoroughly. Heat was one of the few reliable rules people had. A long simmer softened tough ingredients, and it also felt reassuring. The steady boil was a quiet kind of protection. So let's end with one more slow scene. A winter evening, outside, the streets are quieting, a cart rumbles in the distance, then fades. Inside a small room, a family sits near embers. The pot is empty for the night, but it has been rinsed and set aside. Cups are stacked. A cloth hangs near warmth, drying. The house smells of smoke and bread and something faintly sour from stored food. It is not a perfect smell, but it is the smell of home. And as the embers dim, the uncertainty of the outside world dims too. For a few hours, the only task is sleep. If you're still awake, you can borrow that permission now. You can let the night hold the parts of life you cannot control. You can let tomorrow wait. One more gentle note. Just before we move on, medieval people did have ideas of cleanliness, even without modern science. Many towns had bathhouses in certain periods and regions, and people understood the comfort of warm water on skin after hard labor. In the countryside, a full bath might be rare. but hands were rinsed, faces were wiped, and clothing was aired out when weather allowed. Floors were swept, bedding was shaken, and smoke was used to keep spaces dry. It wasn't sterile, but it was cared for, and that care, small, patient, repeated, made life feel a little safer. It offered the same quiet message your bed offers you now. You have done what you can for today, and you can rest. When we look back, it can be tempting to imagine medieval people as careless or indifferent, but most were simply busy, tired, and resourceful, doing their best with the tools they had. That gentle realism can be soothing. Perfection isn't required for life to continue, and it isn't required for you to fall asleep. Just breathe slowly and let your mind settle. In part 6, we'll step into the influence of the church fast days, feast days, and how religious calendars shaped what people ate. We'll keep it gentle and story-like, with scenes of quiet households navigating rules, faith, and hunger without turning it into heavy analysis. For now, take another slow breath in and out. Let the medieval world drift farther away. Like a lantern seen across a field, let your own room feel warmer in comparison. And if sleep is approaching, you don't need to meet it halfway. You can simply let go and allow the night to do what it has always done. Cover everything softly and bring rest. Welcome back, dear listener. Let your breathing slow for a moment, as if you're matching it to the gentle rocking of a boat. In and out. If your thoughts are still busy, you don't need to chase them away. Just let them soften around the edges and let the story become the main thing your mind is holding. Tonight we step into a part of medieval life that touched nearly everyone, rich and poor. The influence of the church, not only through prayer and bells and rituals, but through something very practical: food. Because in medieval Europe, the calendar was not only a matter of seasons, it was also a matter of holy days, fast days, and rules about what should or should not be eaten. And as always, we'll keep this calm. We won't turn it into a lecture. We'll tell it like a slow walk through candlelight. Imagine morning in a medieval village. The church bell rings, not loudly in your ears, but distantly, like a sound floating over fields. The bell marks time in a world without digital clocks. It tells people when to gather, when to rest, when to remember something larger than their own hunger and fatigue. For many peasants, faith was not an abstract idea. It was woven into daily survival. When crops grew, it felt like blessing. When drought came, it felt like a test. When a child recovered from illness, it felt like grace. The church, in this sense, offered meaning, sometimes comfortingly, sometimes heavily, but always present. Now, the church also had rules. Many of those rules centered on discipline, training the spirit by asking the body to accept limits. One of the most important practices was fasting, especially during Lent, the 40 days leading to Easter. To a wealthy household, Lent could be inconvenient, but manageable. If meat was forbidden, they could serve fish. If dairy was restricted, they might use almond milk or imported luxuries. If the rules tightened, they could still soften the experience with spices and carefully prepared dishes. For a poor household, however, Lent could feel very different, because the daily diet of many peasants was already restricted. They were not eating meat often anyway. Their meals were already heavy on bread and grain porridge, with vegetables when possible. So when the church asked them to give up meat, dairy, and eggs, it could feel less like voluntary discipline and more like the world narrowing even further. Still, people followed, not always perfectly, but often sincerely. Fear of social judgment mattered. Fear of eternal consequences mattered. And beyond fear, there was also a kind of quiet dignity in obedience, a belief that enduring hunger for a time could mean something, could shape the soul, could be counted as a spiritual offering. Let's step into a small home during Lent. The day is grey. The wind taps the roof. Inside, a family sits near the hearth. The pot holds thin pottage. The bread is dark and dense. On an ordinary day, perhaps there would have been little cheese, or a bit of fat saved from a rare piece of meat. But Lent has arrived, and the family has set those things aside, trying to honor the rules. A mother portions out the meal carefully, not because she is stingy, but because she is counting days. A father eats slowly, trying to show strength for the children. The children, too young to understand theology, understand only the feeling in their bellies. They ask questions in small voices. Why can't we have the eggs today? Why can't we have the milk? The parents answer gently, because gentleness is all they can offer when food cannot. In this quiet scene, you can feel how religion shaped food, not only in the kitchen, but in emotion. Food became tied to obedience, guilt, virtue, and hope. The table was not just a table, it was a place where the soul's story and the body's needs met. No, it wasn't only Lent. The medieval church calendar included many meatless days throughout the year. In some traditions, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were lean days. Certain saints' days required abstinence. Various regions had local practices too. The result was that a large portion of the year contained dietary restrictions of some kind. For the wealthy, this created an entire culture of fish days, a reason to build fish ponds, to cultivate carp and pike, to import salted herring and dried cod. Fish became not merely a food, but a religious solution for the poor. Fish could help, but only when it was accessible. If you lived near a river or sea, you might catch small fish. But inland villages often depended on preserved fish purchased at market, and that required money. So lean days could mean even more bread and pottage than usual food, without the small comforts of fat, milk, or egg. And yet there is another side to the church's influence, softer and more hopeful. Monasteries and abbeys often held land. They had gardens, orchards, fish ponds. They preserved food with careful routines, and they practiced charity, sometimes sincerely, sometimes as duty, sometimes as a way of reinforcing their authority, but often in ways that truly helped the hungry. Imagine a monastery on a cold morning. Stone walls hold warmth in side courtyards. A garden lies dormant in winter, but storerooms are fuller than the average cottages. In the kitchen, monks stir large pots of broth. Bread is baked in steady batches. The air smells of grain and herbs. At the gate, a small line forms. Travelers, widows, hungry children. Men with tired faces, they hold out bowls or hands. A monk, quiet, calm, passes out bread and a ladle of soup. The portion may not be generous by modern standards, but to someone living close to hunger, It is a gift that turns a day from frightening to manageable. This was not universal and not always enough. In times of famine, need overwhelmed charity. But the idea matters. The church could impose burdens through fasting, and it could also offer relief through alms. Now, we must also speak gently of power. The church was not only a spiritual institution, it was a major landowner. It had influence over laws and rulers. It helped shape the boundaries of what peasants could do to feed themselves. For instance, hunting was heavily regulated. Forests were often controlled by nobles, and sometimes by ecclesiastical authorities. Poaching hunting game without permission was a serious offense. For a peasant family watching winter stores thin out, the temptation to snare a rabbit or catch a bird could be strong, but the risk of punishment was real. So imagine a man at the edge of a forest at dusk. He is not a villain, he is simply hungry, and he has children. He sets a small trap quietly, listening for footsteps. The forest is dark, and the law is darker. If he is caught, consequences could be severe, yet he tries anyway, because hunger can push people into choices they would not make in easier times. In this way, the church's world was layered: compassion and authority, charity and restriction, ritual and enforcement, and food moved through all of it. Now, let's return to the emotional rhythm of medieval life, because this is a sleep story first. The church calendar did something soothing, even for the poor. It offered structure in a world where nature could be unpredictable storms. Pests, drought, religion provided predictable cycles. Fast, then feast, Lent, then Easter, lean days, then festival days. Feast days, especially, were bright spots. Christmas, Easter, local saints' days, weddings and baptisms. On these occasions, food could become more abundant, even for poorer households. A family might share meat. A sweet pastry might appear. Ale might be a little stronger. The village might gather, and for a moment, scarcity loosened its grip. These feast days were not only about food, they were about community. They were about singing, praying, and remembering that life contained more than labor. Even a simple treat could feel like joy when the rest of the year was plain. So imagine Easter morning. The air is crisp. The church is full of candlelight. After the service, people return to their homes, and the table looks different. Perhaps there are eggs. Perhaps there is a small piece of meat saved carefully for weeks. The pottage is thicker. The bread is fresher. Children smile more easily. Adults, too, let their faces soften. It is not luxury, but it is relief. And relief is one of the most sleep-friendly feelings. The sense that something difficult has passed and something gentler has arrived. Now, to keep our tone calm, we won't linger on conflict. Instead, we'll notice how these religious food rules shaped cooking itself. Because when meat was forbidden, cooks became inventive, especially in wealthy kitchens. They used fish in many ways. They used almond milk as a substitute for dairy. They created sauces and stews that followed the letter of religious rules while still offering richness. This ingenuity in élite cooking eventually influenced broader cuisine over centuries, turning religious restriction into culinary creativity. For poorer cooks, ingenuity looked simpler, making vegetables and legumes stretch using onions and herbs for flavor, saving drippings when available, and learning which wild greens could brighten a pot. Their creativity was not about impressing guests. It was about sustaining life. And sustaining life, night after night, is a kind of quiet heroism. Let's allow the story to soften again. Picture a village evening on a lean day. The bell has rung. The hearth glows. The family eats pottage in wooden bowls. The father makes a small sign of the cross before eating. The mother thanks God for what exists. The children chew slowly. Outside, the wind moves through bare branches. Inside, there is warmth, and the routine of faith makes the evening feel held, as if the world has rails and the day is moving along them. If you're falling asleep, that feeling being held is what we want. The sense that the night has shape, that you don't have to carry everything alone, that something older and steadier is present. As we close part 6, I'll leave you with one gentle image. A monastery kitchen at dawn. A monk stirs a pot with slow patience. Steam rises. A second monk kneads dough in silence, his hands moving like a prayer. Outside, a line forms at the gate. Bowls are held out. Bread is broken. Soup is ladled. No one speaks loudly. The air is cold. But the food is warm, and warmth for a human being is sometimes enough. In part 7, we'll move into the rare spectacle of medieval feasting among nobles, the great hall, the candles, the spices, the elaborate dishes, and we'll explore how even abundance carried its own discomforts. In a world without modern food safety, we'll keep the tone slow and soothing, like watching firelight dance on stone. For now, let your breath stay gentle. In and out. Let the bell sound fade. Let the candles dim. Let the table become a quiet memory. And if sleep is arriving, you can let it arrive. You don't need to do anything else tonight. Welcome back. Dear listener, settle your head a little deeper into the pillow, as if you're finding the exact spot where the day finally lets go. Take a slow breath in and let it out. If you're still awake, there's nothing to fix. You can simply listen and let the story do the work of quieting your mind. Tonight, we step into a world that most medieval people only saw from a distance, the noble feast. Not because we want to dazzle you, but because the contrast itself is part of the history, and we'll keep the tone soft, like candlelight on stone, warm, steady, and not too bright. Imagine a castle at dusk. From the outside, it's a dark silhouette against the fading sky. The walls feel ancient, heavy, certain inside. The air is warmer. Torches flicker in brackets along corridors. Footsteps echo gently on hard floors. And the scent of wood smoke mixes with something richer, roasting meat, warming spices, sweet wine. In the great hall, a long table stretches beneath hanging banners and tapestries. The room is lit by many candles, their flames trembling in draughts that move like invisible wings. The candles soften everything. They soften faces, soften shadows, soften time itself. Servants move quietly, practiced and careful. Their job is to make the evening look effortless, as if abundance simply appears by magic. But behind every platter is hours of labor, chopping, stirring, basting, carrying, cleaning, work done in heat and hurry. mostly unseen. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform, sits the Lord and Lady. Nearby are guests, knights, visiting nobles, wealthy clergy, important local figures. They speak in low voices at first, then brighter as the drink flows. Their clothing is heavy with color and texture wool, linen, perhaps silk for the very fortunate embroidered edges catching the candlelight. And then the food begins to arrive. Not one dish, but many in a slow procession. Roast meats first, perhaps boar, venison, capon. The platters are large enough to feel almost theatrical, as if the kitchen is presenting not only dinner, but power. There are pies with thick crusts, meant to hold heat and keep fillings from spilling. There are bowls of stews and sauces, made rich with fat and thickened with bread or ground nuts. And there are spices. Spices were not only flavor, they were a signal. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, pepper ingredients that had traveled long distances through many hands, through ships and caravans and markets. Their presence on the table said, this household is connected to the wider world. This household can pay for rarity. To a peasant, a pinch of pepper might be unimaginable. To a noble, pepper could be sprinkled with a casual gesture, as if it were as common as salt. Yet even here, we keep our pace gentle. We won't describe anything too sharply. We'll simply let the feast be a soft sea, warm light, slow movement, the steady clink of cups, the muted rustle of cloth. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the hall breathe. The fire in the hearth crackles. A log shifts. Someone laughs, then lowers their voice. A serving tray passes. A dog lies near the edge of the warmth, half asleep, rising only when a bone is tossed before the first bites. There is a small ritual of order. A servant walks the length of the tables with a basin and a cloth. Guests lift their hands, one at a time, and water is poured gently over fingers. It is not modern sanitation, but it is a gesture of refinement, an attempt to begin clean, to separate the feast from the day's dust. Linen napkins are offered. Rings catch the light as hands are dried. The hall grows quieter for a moment, as if everyone agrees to pause and arrive. And then there is the table itself, arranged like a map of status. The highest places are closest to the Lord and Lady. Important guests sit near them, while lesser guests sit farther down, where candlelight is dimmer and conversation is less guarded, at the very end of the room, near doors and draughts. The lowest ranking diners might sit. Even in celebration, hierarchy remains, as steady as stone. The plates, too, are different from what we know. Often, a thick slice of bread called a trencher serves as a base for meat and sauce. It soaks up drippings. It becomes soft and savory. When the meal is finished, those trenchers might be eaten, or gathered and given away to servants or the poor at the gate, depending on custom and household. In that simple practice, you can feel the medieval economy of food. Nothing is quite private. And leftovers are not only waste, but an opportunity. Forks are rare in much of medieval Europe. Knives and spoons are common. Fingers do much of the work. A noble carries a knife as part of dress. And that knife becomes a tool at the table, cutting, lifting, sharing. Servants carve meat with practiced motions, turning large roasts into manageable portions, the knife flashing briefly and then disappearing back into shadow. The soundscape of the feast is its own gentle music. There is the low hum of conversation, the clink of cups, the scrape of wood on wood as trenchers are shifted. Somewhere, a minstrel may play softly, strings plucked, a simple melody that floats beneath the talking. Between courses, people drink, wine for the wealthiest, ale for many, and sometimes a spiced drink meant to warm the belly and settle it honeyed or herb-scented, more medicine than indulgence. Medieval people had their own remedies for heavy meals: fennel, anise, mint, and other familiar plants that soothed the mouth and stomach. After, sweets, small comfits, spiced seeds coated in sugar might be offered. They were tiny and bright, like edible punctuation at the end of a sentence. When the final courses arrive, they often lean toward sweetness: baked fruit, honey cakes, almond pastes shaped into small forms, not always delicate by modern standards, but treasured all the same. The smell of warm spice returns cinnamon, clove folded into dough, stirred into wine, sprinkled lightly as if the household can afford to be generous. And then, slowly, the evening turns toward its end. Servants bring bowls of water again, hands are rinsed, faces are dabbed. The hall's noise lowers as guests grow tired. Some leave in small groups, escorted by torchlight to private chambers or to rooms for visitors. The stone corridors swallow their footsteps one by one. In the kitchens, the work continues quietly after the guests are gone. Pots are scraped, boards are wiped, bones are gathered for broth, bread is set aside. A cook tastes the sauce one last time. Not for perfection, but to see what can become tomorrow's meal. In a wealthy household, abundance does not end at midnight. It merely changes shape, and beyond the castle walls, the night is wide and cold. A traveller on the road sees the castle's lights from afar, tiny warm dots in the distance. A peasant in a cottage hears the faint echo of music on the wind. If the wind is right, most do not see the feast, but they know it exists, and that knowledge becomes part of the social landscape, as real as fields and fences. Now, for a moment, let's step into the kitchens, because kitchens tell the truth behind the performance. The castle kitchen is hotter and louder than the hall. Fires roar in wide hearths. Cauldrons bubble, knives tap and scrape. The air is thick with steam and smoke and the smell of fat dripping onto coals. Cooks move fast, calling to one another, tasting sauces, wiping hands on aprons already stained with the day. A master cook watches everything with sharp attention. He's not only cooking, he is managing a small system: supplies, timing, servants, heat, presentation. One mistake could mean embarrassment in the hall. One spoiled ingredient could mean sickness. And that last part matters, because even the richest feast could carry quiet danger in a world without modern refrigeration and food safety. Meat might be kept too long, fish might arrive in poor condition, milk might sour quickly. A sauce, rich and warm, could hide spoilage for a little while. Medieval people didn't know bacteria, but they knew outcomes. They knew that sometimes a meal was followed by pain and weakness. They knew to be suspicious of certain smells and textures. They knew that the body could be betrayed by what it swallowed. So even in the great hall beneath candles, behind laughter there is a faint thread of caution. Servants might taste dishes before serving. Cooks might use strong herbs or spices that, in part, helped mask flavors that were less than perfect. Guests might eat eagerly anyway, because this is what a feast is for: abundance, display, celebration. And celebration had its own weight. If you've ever eaten too much at a holiday, at a family gathering, you know, the feeling fullness that stops being comforting and starts becoming heavy. Now imagine that feeling in a medieval world, where rich foods were rarer for many, and where the body might not be used to such richness. A noble might indulge in heavy sauces, sweet pastries, roasted meats, then later feel the slow discomfort of excess. We can picture it gently: a guest loosening a belt, leaning back, smiling less, breathing a little slower. Not tragedy, just the body reminding the mind that even pleasure has limits. And then there were the teeth. Medieval dentistry was nothing like ours. Sweet dishes, especially in wealthy households, could be both delight and slow damage. Sugar and honey were prized, but they also left their mark. The noble might enjoy candied treats and then, in later years, suffer aches that no one could easily relieve. So the feast, for all its brightness, was not pure comfort. It was a complex thing: joy mixed with risk, richness mixed with discomfort, beauty mixed with the reality that the medieval body still lived close to illness. Now let's pull back and remember the contrast again. Softly, outside the castle, beyond the walls, there are cottages where bowls are smaller and meals are simpler. Pottage, bread, perhaps a little cheese. The same day is being lived in two very different ways. And yet, both kinds of households end the day with the same human need: rest. This is a quiet point to hold. Medieval inequality was real and deep, but sleep was shared. Everyone, in every class, eventually lay down in darkness, listening to night sounds: wind, rain, the distant bark of a dog hoping for morning. If you're listening to fall asleep, you might find comfort in that shared human rhythm. And now, as the feast nears its end, the hall begins to settle. Plates are cleared, crumbs are brushed away, the fire is stirred. The guests grow sleepy. Some sway slightly with drink, some rise carefully, heavy with food. The room's bright energy softens into a late-night calm. This is a lovely moment to borrow for yourself. Imagine the candles lowering. Imagine the great hall becoming quieter, one conversation at a time. Imagine the warmth remaining, even as voices fade. Because in the end, that is what a feast becomes: warmth and quiet. Once the display is over, in part 8, our final part, we'll close the journey by returning to the everyday table and then gently stepping forward into modern gratitude without preaching, without pressure, simply with perspective. We'll let the story end the way a lullaby ends, slowly, softly, with the lights dimming. For now, take one more slow breath in and out. Let the castle hall fade into the distance. Let the clink of cups become a faint memory. Let the fire settle into embers. And if sleep is approaching, you can let it take you, as quietly as a servant closing a door so no one is disturbed. Welcome, dear listener. Settle in comfortably, just as you are. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your jaw unclench. Take a slow breath in and breathe out as if you're gently fogging a window. Soft and quiet. Tonight we let our journey come to a calm, graceful close. We've walked through medieval kitchens and markets, through storerooms and seasons, through fast days and feast days. We've stood beside humble pots of pottage and watched candlelight shimmer over noble tables. And now we return to the simplest place of all, the everyday table, because it's there, in the ordinary, that the deepest meaning often rests. Imagine a small medieval home at the end of a long day. Outside, the sky has dimmed into the kind of blue that feels like velvet. The village has grown quiet. The sounds of labor have faded into silence, and only the soft rustle of night remains. Inside, the hearth glows with low embers, not bright enough to light every corner, but warm enough to make the room feel held. A pot has been scraped clean. A few bowls are stacked. A loaf dense, dark, and imperfect rests on a board. Someone breaks it slowly, not rushing, not wasting. There is a calm in that motion, the calm of something done 1,000 times. The hands know what to do without thinking. For so many medieval people, food was not entertainment. It was not a menu. It was not a choice between options. It was simply the work of making tomorrow possible. And in that reality, even the smallest comforts mattered. Warmth in the bowl, a bit of fat that made pottage taste less thin, the surprise of an onion in season, the rare softness of fresh bread on baking day. Yet, even in a world where meals could be bland, repetitive, and uncertain, people still found ways to make food more than fuel. They shared it. They made it into ritual, even when the ritual was humble. A family gathered close to the hearth. A neighbor offered a handful of beans. Someone traded eggs for grain. A village came together after the harvest, each household bringing what little it could, and for one evening the pot was fuller. Laughter rose more easily, and the body remembered what it felt like to eat without fear. This is something history often forgets to emphasize. The medieval world was harsh, but it was not only harsh. In every era, people carry each other quietly. They offer warmth in small doses. They create a sense of we in the face of scarcity. Now, if you're listening in bed, you might notice how soothing it is to imagine that kind of simplicity. A single room, a single fire, a single pot, a day ending without screens, without constant noise, without endless decisions. The medieval world had many burdens we would not want, but it also held moments of quiet that modern life sometimes loses. And we can borrow the calm without borrowing the hardship. We can take the gentle rhythm, stirring, simmering, waiting without needing to fear the harvest. Because when we look back at medieval food, one of the strongest feelings it leaves behind is gratitude. Not loud gratitude, not forced gratitude, just a soft awareness. We live in an age where daily nourishment is often easier to find, safer to eat, and more varied than most medieval people could ever imagine. Imagine, for a moment, a medieval peasant stepping into a modern grocery store, not as a comic scene, not as a shock, just as a quiet, wide-eyed moment. They would see fruits from warm climates in the middle of winter, bright berries when snow still covers the ground, loaves of bread soft enough to tear with fingertips, not teeth, spices in jars that cost a few coins instead of a fortune, clean water in bottles, milk that keeps meat stored cold and safe behind glass. They might feel overwhelmed, not because they are foolish, but because abundance can be as startling as scarcity. They lived in a world where every meal was tethered to season and chance. The modern world, at least for many people, can feel like a miracle by comparison. Shelves filled day after day, food traveling across continents, warmth and nourishment available without the same daily struggle. And yet, the medieval perspective offers another gentle lesson to slow down and notice, because when food is scarce, you pay attention, you taste carefully, you save what you can, you don't eat on autopilot, you don't waste without thinking, you understand in your bones that every bite comes from labor and time. It's a lesson we can hold softly, without guilt, a lesson that simply says, when you eat, you can be present. You can let the meal be a small pause in the day, a moment of calm, not just consumption. Now, let's return one last time to the medieval kitchen, because it's a peaceful place to end. The embers are lower now. The air smells faintly of smoke and bread and herbs hung from rafters. A bundle of dried thyme or sage sways gently whenever the door shifts. A crock sits in the corner with something fermenting, quiet and patient. A bucket of water rests nearby, covered to keep it as clean as possible. The household has done what it can. They cannot control the weather. They cannot control the grain price. They cannot control disease, but they can control the fire. They can control the pot. They can control the way they sit together at day's end, speaking softly, eating slowly, letting the night wrap around them. That, in a way, is the heart of our story. Medieval food could be plain, sometimes unpleasant, sometimes even risky, but the people who ate it were not just suffering bodies. They were humans with routines, hopes, and small joys. They survived by adapting, by preserving food, by sharing, by turning scarcity into structure and structure into endurance. And we, listening here today, can feel a gentle kind of kinship with them, not because we want their hardships, but because we recognize their humanity. We recognize tiredness at day's end. We recognize the comfort of warm food. We recognize the relief of being home. We recognize the quiet desire to feel safe. So as you lie here, letting sleep approach, you can let that sense of safety settle into your body. You can let your bed become your hearth. You can let your blanket be your roof. You can let your breath be the steady, simmering sound that keeps the night calm. If thoughts arise, let them be like steam from a pot appearing, drifting, dissolving. You don't have to hold them. You don't have to solve them. You can simply watch them fade in and out. Now, one more gentle image to carry you into rest. Picture a table in a quiet home, not grand, not decorated, just a simple surface, with a bowl placed a center, a wooden spoon beside it, a small piece of bread, a cup. The room is dim. The day's work is finished. Outside, night has fully arrived. Inside, warmth remains. Someone closes the door carefully so no wind slips in. The fire is covered so it can last until morning. The animals settle, the household grows quiet, and then, one by one, they rest. No dramatic ending, no grand speech, just the natural close of a day, soft, steady, inevitable. That is what sleep can be for you too. Not something to chase, not something to force, just the gentle closing of your day, the way a candle lowers itself to a small flame, and then to an ember, and then to darkness. Take one last slow breath in and out. If your eyes are open, they can close when they're ready. If they're already closed, let your face soften. Let your tongue rest in your mouth. Let your hands unclench. You are safe. The day is done, and the night is quiet enough to hold you. Rest well, dear listener.